Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully I'll have a timer. If not, someone could flag. Perfect. Okay, so this is a very unusual space for me to be in. My background is in mental health, and in some ways I'm a little bit envious of the advantage that you have with your tools, your AI. But I think you'll come to see that in some ways mental health is actually the final frontier for AI. So, as cheesy as it might sound, artificial intelligence is a term that I quite like from John C. Havens. And for me, it's all about integrity, that could be data or people, imagination and inclusivity. So I often introduce myself because I've got different hats and it can get a little bit confusing. And I like the hip-hop intro, thank you. So I've been in academia. I'm a data scientist, a neuroscientist. I'm a geek, methods geek. And I've done things like genomics, neuroimaging, big data has been around for a long time, machine learning, all of these things I don't find exciting anymore because it arrived a while ago, this sort of AI ML. So yes, I'm an advisor at the Turing, looking to converge health and finance data, and also the convergence of physical health, because I believe in whole person care. I've got a couple other hats that I'll just put up fairly quickly. Let's see here, but importantly, I just want to say that I have a foot in the startup and the big tech space as well, which has been very interesting to look at social determinants and social prediction models outside of the NHS or healthcare systems, and contrasting that against more conventional data. And also advising chatbots for mental health, AI-based models has also been a really interesting learning curve, how to build empathy or strive to build empathy. And then hopefully if I have time at the end of the talk, I'll talk about where I really spend most of my thinking time, which is not AI definitions, because that is scary, but the convergence of AI and human intelligence. So how can we actually bring the humans into this so that we can have a strong input from both the AI and the HI? And also, just to shamelessly plug my summer conference held within the precincts of Westminster Abbey every summer on digital innovation in mental health. And this summer we'll be covering a consortium that I just launched, the FinHealth Tech Consortium, looking at financial determinants as well as whole person care. Now, I said I was a little bit jealous of this field, but I think everyone will have to start worrying about mental health if you haven't already. So I'm sure you're aware of this, at least the 2020 unipolar depressive disorders, but depression is looking like by 2030 going to be on everyone's agenda. So when I say convergence of physical and mental health, I think we need to start building AI that really addresses these areas. And these are just some of the reasons why, again, I won't overstate this because it's quite obvious, but comorbidities can lead to poor outcomes. And even if there is no pathophysiological connection to the disease or the disorder you're interested in, there could be indirect impacts where medication adherence is affected by psychological factors or other factors that worsen the condition that you're interested in due to lifestyle things. So I went on an exploring adventure just to see a couple of studies. Where are we at the crossroads of psychological research and gastroenterology, which was a very new thing for me. But of course, the prevalence of anxiety, depression, severity of symptoms, we're seeing this increasing in, I would say, almost all populations in health spaces. But this is just an example. And also that we have to think about conflicts between individuals and relationships. So how can we build AI that also addresses these issues or can create some sort of awareness of the context and the backdrop to the disease that you're interested in? So like Bilal, we were how do you handle this topic in now 17 minutes, although my clock's just died. And I thought this is really easy. So I'll just answer it in one slide, and then I can talk about whatever I want. So yes, there are many legal and ethical risks. And to be honest, there's no way I could talk about this. I'm writing a book on digital ethics in mental health. So I would love to have that conversation in depth, if helpful, maybe outside of this. I will pull in some examples as we go along, but I wanted to spend a bit more time on topics that you might not have thought about, and I can share some of my experiences as a data scientist, but someone who also goes inside prisons and does psychoeducation and things like that. So yeah, I really want to touch upon, not do we really need AI, because I do think we do, or we can certainly benefit from this, but not necessarily in all areas. And as I said before, it's the convergence that I really care about, and the detail, as Bilal set this up so well. It's about the specificity of the discussion. So how are you putting this together, in what context? That's really where I am. And then this additional question, which was just super interesting and challenging, but the art of medicine, I think that's a talk in and of itself. I'll try and bring in some of my experiences using art therapy or art and music-based interventions with technology and patients or mental health service users. So that's towards the end. And this is a familiar slide because Bilal took it from me. I trained you well. You can copy all my slides, Bilal. No, but okay, this saves time. So we're friends. Okay, but this is just, Bilal set me up in a really good way. Bilal set me up in a really good way because it's not just about the Turing test and trying to mimic humans, so chatbots and all these various things. You have to make a decision at some point, and I'll just put up this kind of really wordy, waffly thing, and then I'll just talk over it. And if you're interested, we can have discussions after. But some very basic retrieval-based models. Having a predetermined syntax it sounds boring, but it can be a very, very good thing. You have complete control over what you put in as a clinician or as a researcher, and you just are able to kind of have a very strong safety clinical net. There are a million other models, but just as an example, generative models would be really fun to create a chatbot with a generative model, but it's risky in a clinical context because it can actually give you a response to a question it's never seen, and it's prone to errors, especially in a medical area, which really needs careful thinking. So there's just so many different models. How do you combine it without creating harm? So in my opinion, we build up very slowly, very carefully, and we bring in things like sequence to sequence, which will remember that perhaps the patient or the service user experienced sexual assault 10 years ago, and we're going to avoid offering CBT therapies with certain components. But how do we build this in without overbuilding and just using shiny tools that actually get us into trouble, and then we have to create solutions to undo the damage? You might have seen this in BMJ Innovations, but this just, I don't know what to say about this. It's just sort of astonishing. So this is February 2018. To be honest, I didn't believe it, or I couldn't feel it. I couldn't connect with that. So I did my own experiment at the American Psychiatric Association. And I was giving a symposium on AI, and I asked everyone in the room to participate in a survey with their consent if they wanted to. And I asked them two questions. Had they downloaded the American Psychiatric Association app, and had they ever used their phone for clinical reasons, to talk about patients, et cetera? And it really did surprise me that the vast majority, or at least 80% of the individuals, had said yes to both questions. And the worrying thing here is that even in an American psychiatric setting, we're talking about AI and ethics, we see that there's potential for the APA meeting to access all of my files, all my photos of my little girl, anything on my phone could just be gone if I wasn't paying attention to deny this. And it just made me think, why do they need it in the first place? And it was going to a third party named Double Dutch. So there's a lot of things going on here that we have to be really careful. And I suppose the message on that previous slide was accountability. We're all accountable in our own ways. So we have to just carefully not point fingers, but understand what we could do to correct our ways. Maybe some of you have seen this. But again, an algorithm can identify this as a panda with about 60% confidence. And if you add the smallest fraction of noise, I think it's 0.07 or something very, very small, all of a sudden it really throws the algorithm, and it now says that the panda is a gibbon and that it is certain that it is a gibbon. This is obvious, it's wrong, but in mental health and health, but especially mental health because it's ignoring subjective truths, this is very dangerous and easy to get wrong. And how do we measure that? So I think the scale of large data sets, the glamour, everything, we need to sort of familiarize ourselves and get past that narrative and normalize ourselves to data sets aren't just the answer of collecting data, and algorithms as well. We have to just test them, generalize them in fair, inclusive ways. So I apologize, this is a lot of words, but just look at the yellow ones if it's interesting. I'll just focus on this last point here, that when you go digital, especially in mental health, and your first point of contact with someone is digital, you're missing out opportunities, or I suppose you're missing the chance to discover comorbidities such as thyroid conditions or other physical things that you would normally be able to capture in a therapeutic one-to-one environment. Alcohol on the breath, bruises in locations, and various other things as well. So the first point of contact being digital is also something that we have to be very careful how we decide to then proceed. And of course, there's just a lot of, I won't go into it, but as a data scientist, I'm floored every day how the data isn't as good as you think it is. So I can't really speak to all of these, but there are a lot of ways that we can collect data. The facial recognition tools, the speech, there's just so many ways that we can examine data. But again, it's not enough just to collect data. We have to have a very specific purpose, a human-focused purpose. And so I guess one of the areas in mental health is looking at suicide. And it is a rare, rare event, but it is an area that people have focused our initial efforts in AI. There's some encouraging studies, just looking at medical health records, outperforming conventional approaches if you use questionnaire information. This is a hint at the fact that if we add more, we'll get more out. And that was a huge data set, the first study. The second study, around 5,000 people, but the interesting thing here is that this is for people who were attempting suicide for the first time, this data. And we're seeing area under the curve. Don't worry too much about the detail, but yeah, it's going up. Personally, I think we're hitting a wall, though. I think we've had an exciting time boosting these metrics, these kind of crude metrics to this level, and now we need humans to get us further to that 100%. But we're still seeing things like this, like the ability to predict suicide attempts for future events is near zero. So hopefully my next slide will talk about, after this, I'll talk about some ethics. That was in a medical context. This is now looking at data using Facebook, sort of in the wild, so to speak. And again, we're seeing some interesting things that we might be able to predict relapse based on Facebook posts and things. So it's encouraging, but again, when you look at the metrics and how well they're performing, it seems like we're all hitting a wall right now, in mental health at least. So there's some of the envy for your field there. And just to say that, just to quote a really great paper here, that yeah, these metrics might not be the way forward. And what is the clinical utility? This is where we really need the clinicians to say that that's great, but doesn't really do anything for us to help us. And it just gets scarier when we move into unsupervised learning, which I can explain a little bit more later. But when you don't label data or show the panda and just throw it out there and see what comes back, again, imagine that in a mental health or complex health scenario. And an interesting point here, just that even if you do get to a metric that's almost perfect, again, it's about the clinical outcome. Has it helped you? Have you advanced anything? These questions are so important. I think they should drive the model and decisions. So yes, I'll just jump into some of this. Annotation and labeling data is so crucial. Again, in mental health, we have so much context, and it's very difficult unless you have good data and inclusive data, diverse and representative data. You're going to run into some serious problems, as we've seen before, where African American text was incorrectly labeled incorrectly determined to be hate speech. And there are so many other examples to that. And so I think in my area, it is about the context, understanding, because if you can't even see what you're looking for, you'll never find it in the data. The data can't just tell you. You have to be very granular, to use Bilal's term. That's very, very true. Okay, so again, this inaccurately labeled training data when you don't understand the language. And what I won't do is, I won't go into this, but we're starting to see colleagues of mine at Columbia are now starting to bring culture, bring context to the content that's already kind of machine data driven approaches, but bring that. And here's an example. I would love to know if anyone knew what was inside this Sprite bottle. So I would never use you to label my data because this is actually promethazine and codeine. And this is very popular across the world by to be drunk by young people to feel the effects of drowsiness. It could potentially lead to seizures and things like that. So if I understood this and put that in my data and searched, I'm fine. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find anything. Or worse, you'll find something positive that's just a false positive. Okay, so yes, some of the ethics, it's really hard to go through all of them, but just to highlight some, you could be removing some benefits from some people who had cerebral palsy home care, and the care could be cut by a half, and all of a sudden they have to learn how to cope, and they have no way to understand the context of that decision. You could be adding false positives, as I mentioned before. For mental health, you could have hospitalization against the will, as we've seen with Facebook and contacting police to go to people's homes who might have said they're suicidal, but when you arrive at their door, they say they're not, and against their will, they still have to go. Let's see, here we go. And these are just some other specific examples of decisions that people, or sorry, a doctor might make if they're biased and someone comes in as a high-risk suicide patient being treated for something else. So this is just an example with opioids and the consequences that they might experience outside of their mental health. And of course, in certain countries, penalties, incarceration, with suicide being illegal, this data is very precious, and if it's sold to third parties in countries that will use it for ill purposes, this could be very dangerous. But again, in countries where you would think everything was above board, this can also still be used for potential immigration issues. So I do like this quote. We are at the beginning, and this is where I spend a lot of my time thinking. This is a quick example of this sort of crowdsourcing idea where you can get gamers to start labeling images, which I think would be really cool with your field, just to help bring humans into the labeling process to improve the quality. So as they're gaming or as they're doing a task, they can start labeling data for you. And here's another example with brain mapping, and again, asking people, video game players, to just map these things. It's a really cool way to bring humans and AI together. And of course, the clinician, just to emphasize that you can't lose that human touch and that ability to say that one thing that really matters to the individual. And this quote I think about on a daily basis, because we are empowered to drive our own AI future. I really do believe that. And some of the work that I'm doing, which I have 2 minutes to, or a minute, just to explain very quickly, is through the power of hip hop and using human-centered algorithmic solutions. So we use computational linguistics, rhyme algorithms, we measure sentiment intensity, body movement detection, dance biometrics. Importantly, we have full engagement with this community because we have gone into a community that cares for itself already, and we are respectfully building tools that they find fun and engaging. Very quickly, I'll just show you some of the social prescribing stuff we're doing with key changes. This is heart rate data across time. And when someone writes a song, they edit their song, they go into the recording studio, and then they have a post-take drop in heart rate. What we're trying to do really is look deeply in their data at their heart rate, what they're doing when they're writing, they're thinking, and mapping out the qualitative and the quantitative convergence. There's a sudden stop, things happen in their data, continue writing. Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay here. And most importantly, we have the words that the person has said, which are very meaningful and often relate to mental health in very raw ways. So through Lyrical Combat, which I'm a co-founder of, we're setting up some some startup things with my last few seconds. I'll just say where we get people to rap, and we look at, we're now working with the NHS and a large fintech for a separate project, but we're looking at how we can use the voice and the rapping and the freestyle to look at sentiment, intensity, and natural language processing and physiology of service users with psychosis or depression or whatnot. And there's a lot of evidence for this rapping in the brain. Being a neuroscientist is very important. So I'll just end there because I'm finished and over time. So thank you.